The moment the German prisoners saw the factory lights stretching across the horizon, they understood the war had already been lost. Virginia, October 1944. The transport train rolled south through the American night with a rhythm so steady it barely sounded human. Steel wheels hummed against polished tracks. Warm air drifted through the open windows, carrying the scent of coal smoke, machine oil, and something else Karl Brenner could not immediately recognize. Prosperity. He sat silently beside the window, his gray prison jacket folded neatly across his lap despite the lingering heat. Around him, dozens of German prisoners filled the passenger car in exhausted silence, their faces pale beneath the dim yellow ceiling lamps. Some tried to sleep. Others stared blankly at the darkness beyond the glass. But Karl could not stop looking outside. Every few miles, another industrial yard appeared out of nowhere. Endless rows of freight cars. Warehouses larger than entire German villages. Cranes moving even at midnight. Then came the factories. The first one rose beside the tracks like a glowing city of steel. Smoke climbed into the night sky in slow white columns while thousands of windows burned with light. Karl leaned forward without realizing it. The building seemed endless. Conveyor belts moved behind giant panes of glass. Sparks burst like orange rain deep inside the structure. Men in hard hats walked across overhead catwalks carrying clipboards and coffee mugs as though it were the middle of the afternoon instead of nearly 1 in the morning. The train slowed slightly as it passed the complex. Karl watched a line of brand-new military trucks rolling out of enormous loading bays one after another without pause. Fresh olive paint gleamed beneath floodlights. Forklifts moved constantly. Workers shouted directions over the sound of machinery. Nobody appeared tired. Nobody appeared hungry. The entire place felt awake in a way he had never imagined possible. Across the aisle, another prisoner whispered quietly in German. "How many factories are there?" Nobody answered him. Captain Thomas Reed walked slowly down the center aisle, checking on the prisoners with calm, almost casual professionalism. His uniform was pressed despite the long hours. A paper coffee cup rested in one hand, while the other balanced against the swaying train car. He noticed the prisoners staring through the windows, but said nothing. He had seen this reaction before. The silence always came first. Karl kept watching the factory disappear behind them. Then another appeared. Then another. Steel mills. Oil tanks. Freight depots stretching for acres beneath giant electric floodlights. In Germany, entire cities disappeared into darkness after air raids. Here, the night itself seemed illuminated by industry. The train passed a rail yard so massive Karl could not see the end of it. Hundreds of locomotives sat lined beside endless cargo platforms loaded with tanks, crates, airplane parts, tires, barrels of fuel, stacks of lumber, coils of steel cable. Workers moved through it all with mechanical precision. No panic, no confusion, just movement. Constant movement. Karl remembered the speeches he had heard before the war. America was soft. America was divided. America was weak. Yet outside his window stood a nation that appeared to manufacture without sleep. A sudden orange glow lit the sky ahead. Another factory, larger than the last. Smoke rolled across the moonlight while giant assembly cranes moved slowly like creatures from another world. Karl swallowed hard. Beside the tracks, a billboard flashed briefly under the train lights. Ford Motor Company, building for victory. He stared at the words until they vanished into darkness. Then he looked toward Captain Reed for the first time. The American officer took a slow sip of coffee before glancing toward the glowing horizon outside the windows. "Factories run 24 hours now," Reed said quietly. "War doesn't sleep." Karl looked back toward the endless lights stretching across the American night, and for the first time since his capture in France, he no longer felt like he was entering enemy territory. He felt like he was witnessing something far larger than war itself. The train stopped just after 2 in the morning beneath a ceiling of white industrial smoke that drifted across the stars like slow-moving clouds. Karl Brenner stepped carefully onto the platform with the other prisoners, his boots striking clean concrete, still warm from the day's heat. The station itself felt impossibly alive for that hour. Electric lamps buzzed overhead. Freight cranes groaned somewhere beyond the rail yard. Men in denim coveralls pushed carts stacked with wooden crates, while railroad workers shouted schedules across the tracks with the energy of men beginning a workday rather than ending one. Carl looked toward the skyline and saw factory towers glowing red against the darkness. They stretched for miles. Every smokestack carried fire at its crown. Every window burned with light. Beside him, Otto Weiss removed his cap slowly and whispered, "It looks like the whole country is working tonight." Captain Thomas Reed motioned for the prisoners to line up near a water station beside the tracks. No guards pointed rifles. No one barked threats. An American rail employee in grease-stained gloves rolled out a steel cart filled with paper cups and silver coffee urns that released clouds of steam into the cool night air. Another worker handed out sandwiches wrapped in white paper. Ham, cheese, fresh bread. Carl accepted one automatically, still distracted by the factories beyond the station. The sandwich felt soft in his hands. Real bread, not dark ration loaves stretched thin with substitutes. Nearby, an enormous freight train thundered past on the adjacent line carrying tanks covered beneath canvas tarps. The ground vibrated beneath Carl's boots. Flat cars continued rolling by for nearly 2 full minutes without stopping. Tanks, trucks, fuel containers, crates marked aircraft parts. Endless cargo moving deeper into the American interior. Carl stopped chewing halfway through the sandwich. He tried counting the train cars, but lost track somewhere past 80. A railroad engineer noticed the prisoners staring and laughed quietly as he lit a cigarette beside the platform. "That one came from Detroit," he said proudly to no one in particular. "Got 3 more coming before sunrise." Captain Reed leaned against a steel column sipping coffee while the prisoners listened. The engineer pointed toward the southern horizon where giant orange lights flickered against the clouds. "Ford plant runs all night now," he continued. "So does the shipyard. Folks barely sleep anymore." Carl followed the man's finger toward the distant glow. The sky itself seemed alive, not with fire from destruction, but with production. Endless motion, endless electricity. Somewhere far away, a factory whistle blew through the darkness. Then another answered it. Otto stared at the rail yard in silence before speaking again in German. "In Munich, we waited 3 months for replacement truck parts." Carl nodded slowly without looking away from the horizon. Here, entire trains carried nothing but replacement parts. Thousands of them. A young American woman walked past the platform carrying a metal lunch pail beneath one arm. Her blonde hair was tucked beneath a blue factory scarf. Grease stains marked the sleeves of her work jacket, but her posture remained upright and calm despite the hour. She could not have been older than 25. She glanced briefly toward the prisoners before continuing toward a waiting bus already filled with shipyard workers. No fear. No hatred, just another shift ending before another began. Carl watched the bus disappear into the industrial fog. The prisoners had expected America to feel strained by war, exhausted, fragile. Instead, every mile deeper into the country revealed something harder to understand. The war did not appear to weaken America. It appeared to feed it. Captain Reed checked his watch beneath the station lights before folding the timetable back into his pocket. "Train leaves in 10 minutes. He said calmly. "Long ride ahead." Carl looked once more toward the burning skyline beyond the tracks. Giant cranes moved slowly above the factories like shadows against the glowing sky. The machines never stopped. Neither did the lights. And somewhere deep inside his chest, a quiet certainty began settling into place like cold iron. Germany had prepared for armies. It had not prepared for this. By dawn, the train had crossed into Pennsylvania, and the factories only grew larger. Carl Brenner woke to the sound of metal striking metal somewhere beyond the windows. Deep, rhythmic, almost mechanical enough to feel alive. Pale morning light spilled through the passenger car as the prisoners slowly stirred around him. Some rubbed sleep from their eyes. Others remained motionless beneath army blankets, exhausted from the long journey. But Carl was already sitting upright beside the glass, watching America unfold beyond the tracks with the quiet focus of a man trying to solve a puzzle too large to understand. Smoke drifted low across the valleys outside. Steel towns appeared one after another along winding rivers lined with railroads and power lines. Blast furnaces towered over entire neighborhoods. Freight elevators crawled up the sides of grain silos taller than church steeples. Endless pipes crossed overhead like giant iron skeletons stretching from building to building. Every few miles, another factory whistle echoed through the hills. The train rounded a bend, and suddenly the entire valley opened before them. Carl felt his breath catch in his throat. Miles of factories filled the riverbanks beneath a gray morning sky. Smokestacks rose by the dozens. Railroad tracks spread in every direction carrying coal, steel, oil, lumber, machinery. Giant cranes moved above shipbuilding docks where unfinished vessels sat in dry berths larger than anything Carl had ever imagined. Some ships already floated in the river waiting for crews and supplies. Others remained wrapped in scaffolding, while welders showered sparks down their steel hulls. The entire valley moved like a single machine. Otto stepped beside him quietly. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Otto finally whispered, "This cannot all be for one city." Carl said nothing because he was thinking the exact same thing. Captain Thomas Reed walked down the aisle carrying a folded newspaper beneath one arm. He noticed the prisoners gathered by the windows again. "Pittsburgh," he said simply. "Steel country." One of the younger prisoners frowned. "How many factories are here?" Reed glanced toward the river valley outside before answering. "Enough." The train slowed near a switching yard crowded with locomotives painted black beneath layers of soot and steam. Workers in heavy gloves moved between the rail lines carrying lunch pails and thermoses of coffee. Carl noticed something strange. Most of the men looked tired, but none of them looked defeated. Their movements remained quick, focused, purposeful. Even the women working near the freight platforms moved with the same calm efficiency. A young woman wearing welding goggles stood atop a flatbed railcar, directing a crane operator with practiced hand signals. Her face was streaked with ash, but her posture remained steady against the cold morning wind. Nearby, another woman climbed down from a locomotive carrying rolled blueprints beneath her arm. Carl stared at the scene in silence. In Germany, women waited in ration lines beside damaged buildings and darkened streets. Here, they helped run factories larger than entire military compounds. The train continued deeper into the industrial district. Carl watched workers pour glowing steel into massive molds, while overhead cranes carried entire train wheels through the air like toys. Heat shimmered above the foundries even from hundreds of yards away. The smell of coal smoke filled the passenger car through the open windows. Then came the sound. Endless machinery. Presses. Hammers. Engines. Belts. A constant roar rolling across the valley without pause. Otto shook his head slowly. "How do they supply all this?" he asked quietly. Captain Reed folded his newspaper beneath one arm and looked out toward the factories with an expression that was almost thoughtful. Coal from West Virginia. Iron from Minnesota. Oil from Texas. Rubber from overseas. Trains from everywhere. He paused briefly. America builds by connecting things. Carl looked back toward the valley where smoke drifted across the river beneath hundreds of electrical lines. Connecting things. The phrase lingered in his mind while the train rolled forward past mile after mile of machinery and steel. Germany had built for conquest. America seemed to build because building itself had become part of the nation's bloodstream. And as the factory whistles echoed behind them in the cold Pennsylvania morning, Carl began to understand something far more unsettling than defeat. This country had not merely prepared for war. It had reorganized its entire civilization around production. The train left Pittsburgh shortly after sunrise, but the factories followed them west like an endless chain stitched across the American landscape. Carl Brenner stood near the rear door of the passenger car, watching the countryside shift between industrial towns and rolling farmland that looked untouched by war. Every small town seemed connected to tracks. Every river carried barges loaded with coal or steel. Even the farms appeared mechanized in ways he had never seen before. Tractors moved across wide open fields beside towering grain elevators painted with company logos visible from miles away. Silver silos reflected the morning sun like polished metal. Telephone wires stretched endlessly beside the tracks. Power lines crossed valleys and climbed hillsides in perfect rows. Everything connected. Everything moved. Around mid-morning, the train slowed outside Cleveland near an enormous manufacturing district that spread for miles along the horizon. Carl pressed closer to the window as smoke drifted across the tracks in thick gray layers. Giant assembly buildings stood shoulder to shoulder beside freight depots crowded with railcars carrying engines, tires, crates of tools, and endless stacks of raw steel. Then he saw the airplanes. At first, he thought the shapes beside the factory were unfinished fuselages waiting for transport. But as the train rolled closer, he realized entire bombers sat lined wing to wing across the tarmac outside the plant. Dozens of them. Fresh paint gleamed beneath the sunlight. Workers moved around the aircraft carrying ladders, hoses, toolboxes, clipboards. More airplanes rolled slowly out of hangars in the distance. Carl blinked hard as though his eyes had betrayed him. Otto stood behind him, staring in disbelief. How long would this take in Germany? Otto whispered quietly. Carl thought about the answer for several seconds. Months, he finally said. Maybe longer. Yet here they stood beside tracks where airplanes appeared to emerge from buildings like products from a bakery. The train came to a full stop beside a refueling station, near the edge of the industrial complex. Steam hissed beneath the locomotives while railroad crews connected hoses and checked wheels with metal hammers. Prisoners stepped outside briefly to stretch their legs beneath the supervision of Captain Reed and several military police officers. The air smelled of gasoline, machine oil, and hot steel. Across the tracks, workers streamed through factory gates as one shift ended and another began. Hundreds of them. Men and women carrying lunch pails and thermoses moved in organized lines beneath large banners that read, "Keep them flying and production wins wars." Carl noticed something else. The workers laughed. Some smoked cigarettes while waiting for buses. Others talked casually beneath the roar of machinery pouring from the open factory doors. No one appeared frightened. No one appeared exhausted beyond endurance. The war existed here, but it had not hollowed these people. It had mobilized them. Nearby, a woman in blue overalls stood beside a loading dock reviewing paperwork with a foreman twice her age. Blonde hair escaped beneath her factory scarf while grease marked the sleeves of her jacket. She looked up briefly toward the prisoners before returning to the clipboard in her hands. Efficient, focused, calm. Carl remembered the speeches from Berlin describing American society as weak and divided. Yet the factory gates behind the woman swallowed thousands of workers every few minutes with the precision of a military operation. Captain Reed walked over beside Carl while the locomotives continued refueling. Aircraft plant, Reed said, noticing where Carl was looking. They build bombers there. Carl stared at the endless factory complex. How many? He asked quietly. Reed glanced toward the assembly buildings. Enough to replace losses faster than the enemy can count them. The answer settled heavily in the cold autumn air between them. Somewhere deep inside the factory district, a siren signaled another shift change. Doors opened. Trucks rolled forward. Conveyor systems resumed moving. The entire complex seemed to breathe like a living organism powered by electricity, steel, and routine. Carl looked toward the long rows of newly completed aircraft shining beneath the pale Ohio sunlight. And for the first time in his life, he understood that industrial power could feel almost invisible until standing directly beside it. Not loud in the way propaganda described strength. Not dramatic. Just constant. Relentless. Patient. Like a machine too large to ever stop turning. The train crossed Indiana after sunset beneath a sky the color of cold steel, and still the lights continued. Carl Brenner sat alone, near the rear window while most of the prisoners slept around him, their quiet breathing blending with the steady rhythm of the rails beneath the passenger car. Outside, America rolled past in long strips of darkness interrupted by sudden explosions of industry. Refineries burned against the horizon like artificial suns. Freight depots glowed beneath rows of electric floodlights. Factory windows stretched for blocks beside rivers lined with barges carrying coal and oil through the night. Carl had stopped trying to count the trains hours ago. They were everywhere. Northbound, southbound, endless chains of locomotives carrying machinery, fuel, steel beams, crates of ammunition, tractors, trucks, grain. Every rail yard seemed larger than the last. Every city appeared connected to another by lines of steel and electricity. Shortly before midnight, the transport train slowed near Chicago, and the sight beyond the windows forced several prisoners awake without a single word being spoken. The skyline rose from the darkness like another world entirely. Hundreds of illuminated windows climbed into the night sky, while giant industrial districts surrounded the city in every direction. Smoke drifted above the rooftops beneath flashing red tower lights. Railroad bridges crossed black water crowded with cargo ships and tugboats still moving despite the hour. Carl stared silently as elevated trains rattled between buildings glowing gold against the cold autumn night. Even the streets appeared alive. Cars moved through intersections. Neon signs flickered above restaurants and theaters. Factory whistles echoed from somewhere deeper within the city. It did not feel like a nation fighting a world war. It felt like a civilization operating at full speed. Otto stepped beside him, carrying a blanket around his shoulders. "How can they fuel all this?" he whispered quietly. Carl did not answer because he no longer knew where to begin. The train finally stopped beneath the iron framework of a massive freight terminal near the southern edge of the city. Steam drifted across the platform while workers loaded cargo onto neighboring rail cars under towering floodlights. Captain Thomas Reed ordered a brief stop for inspection and supplies. Prisoners stepped carefully onto the platform, stretching stiff legs beneath the cold wind rolling off Lake Michigan. Carl immediately noticed the smell. Coffee, fresh bread, hot oil from nearby machine shops. Somewhere close by, meat sizzled on a grill inside a diner packed with railroad workers despite the late hour. Through the windows, he could see waitresses carrying plates beneath hanging ceiling fans while men in factory uniforms drank coffee beside stacks of newspapers. One headline caught Carl's eye from across the room. "Record aircraft output this month." Nearby, a radio played soft jazz music between war reports and factory advertisements. Nothing about the scene felt temporary. It felt permanent, established, confident. A young railroad clerk stood beside a cargo manifest speaking with Captain Reed while freight cranes moved overhead, carrying massive steel containers through the night air. "Another shipment from California arrives tomorrow," the clerk said casually. "Engines from Detroit next week." He spoke about machinery the way farmers discussed weather. Routine. Predictable. Carl listened quietly while warm steam drifted from the nearby coffee stand into the freezing air. Then came the moment he would remember for the rest of his life. Across the freight yard, a giant billboard illuminated by white floodlights stood above the tracks. "Buy war bonds. Build the future." Behind it stretched miles of factories still glowing long after midnight. Thousands of Americans remained awake inside them. Building, welding, shipping, designing, feeding the machine without pause. Carl suddenly remembered Berlin during the winter blackout of 1943. Dark apartment windows, silent streets, long ration lines beneath gray skies. The memory felt distant now, almost fragile. Here, even the darkness seemed electrified. Captain Reed finished checking paperwork before walking toward the prisoners near the platform edge. He noticed Carl staring toward the skyline again. "Chicago never really sleeps anymore," Reed said quietly. Carl looked out toward the endless industrial lights reflecting against low clouds above the city. "Does any part of this country sleep?" he asked. Reed thought about the question for a moment before shaking his head slightly. "Not while the war is on." The answer settled into the cold night air between them while freight trains rolled endlessly through the illuminated rail yards behind the city. And standing there beneath the glow of American industry stretching across the horizon, Carl realized the factories were not simply supporting the nation. They had become the nation itself. The train left Chicago before dawn beneath freezing rain that streaked across the windows in silver lines. Most of the prisoners remained asleep beneath wool blankets while the locomotive pushed westward through the darkness with steady mechanical force. Carl Brenner sat awake again beside the glass, unable to rest. Every mile through America seemed to dismantle another certainty he had carried across the Atlantic. Outside, the industrial districts slowly gave way to open farmland stretching beneath low gray clouds. Yet even here, far from the giant cities and steel valleys, the signs of production never disappeared. Grain elevators rose beside tiny towns like concrete cathedrals. Long freight trains crossed distant plains carrying oil tanks and machinery toward horizons hidden beneath rain and smoke. Massive barns stood beside tractors larger than some military vehicles Carl had seen during the war. Windmills turned slowly above fields connected by endless power lines. Everything appeared organized, maintained, supplied. Near sunrise, the train slowed outside a manufacturing town in Iowa, where rows of brick warehouses lined the tracks beside a sprawling agricultural equipment plant. Steam drifted upward from factory roofs into the cold morning air, while workers crossed parking lots carrying lunch pails beneath umbrellas. Carl noticed something immediately. The parking lot itself seemed enormous. Hundreds of automobiles sat in perfect rows despite wartime fuel rationing. Ford sedans, Chevrolet trucks, delivery vans painted with company names. Even the workers arriving for dawn shift carried themselves with quiet confidence. Their jackets looked clean. Their boots looked new. Nothing resembled the exhaustion spreading across Europe. Otto eventually joined Carl near the rear platform, holding 2 paper cups of coffee handed out by an American rail attendant earlier that morning. Still awake? Otto asked quietly. Carl accepted the coffee and nodded toward the factory outside. Look at the size of it. Otto stared through the rain-covered window while giant loading doors opened beside the tracks. Tractors rolled slowly onto freight cars one after another beneath the supervision of workers carrying clipboards and thermoses. Some tractors were painted bright red, others green or silver. Fresh paint reflected beneath the floodlights despite the storm. Otto frowned. Why are they still building farm machines during a war? Before Carl could answer, Captain Thomas Reed approached from behind carrying his folded coat beneath one arm. He overheard the question and glanced out toward the loading yard. Because people still need food, he said simply. Reed leaned beside the window watching the tractors being secured to flat cars. War or not, farms still plant crops. Cities still eat. Factories still ship supplies. He paused briefly. That is how you keep a country running. Carl wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup, while rain tapped softly against the glass. The answer unsettled him more than he expected. Germany had converted nearly everything toward military survival. Here, America seemed capable of fighting a global war while still expanding ordinary civilian life at the same time. The train resumed moving westward through the storm. Fields rolled endlessly beneath gray skies, broken occasionally by small towns clustered around water towers and grain silos. Every town appeared connected to tracks. Every station carried freight schedules posted beside stacks of cargo waiting for pickup. Around midday, the rain stopped, and sunlight finally broke through the clouds across the open plains. The change in atmosphere inside the train car felt immediate. Prisoners moved toward the windows again, while warm lights spilled across the seats and polished metal luggage racks overhead. Then Carl saw something he would remember forever. A line of schoolchildren stood beside a country crossing, waving small American flags as the train passed. Their teachers smiled beneath the bright autumn sunlight, while trucks loaded with grain waited nearby at the crossing gates. Beyond them, another freight train rolled north carrying military vehicles toward some distant coastline. The children waved at both trains with equal excitement. Carl stared silently until the crossing disappeared behind them. In Germany, war had consumed childhood itself. Here, life continued beside it. Captain Reed noticed Carl watching the empty horizon long after the crossing vanished. "You look surprised," Reed said quietly. Carl took several seconds before answering. "Your country does not act like it is afraid." Reed adjusted his coat collar against the draft moving through the train car. "Maybe because we believe we can build faster than problems arrive." The statement sounded almost casual. Yet Carl looked back across the endless American farmland connected by railroads, power lines, highways, and factories, and slowly realized that confidence itself might have been the nation's greatest weapon. Late that afternoon, the train crossed Nebraska beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the horizon itself. Carl Brenner had never seen land stretch this far in any direction without interruption. Fields rolled endlessly beneath pale autumn sunlight, while telephone poles marched beside the tracks in perfect lines disappearing into the distance. Yet even here, far from the giant factories and crowded industrial cities, America still moved with the same quiet rhythm of production. Grain silos rose beside tiny railroad towns every few miles. Freight trains loaded with wheat and cattle crawled across the plains on parallel tracks. Trucks rumbled along distant highways carrying fuel, machinery, lumber. Everything connected back to something larger. The prisoners had grown quieter as the journey continued west. During the first days, they whispered constantly among themselves, comparing factories, rail yards, numbers too large to comprehend. Now most simply watched in silence. The scale of the country had begun exhausting their ability to react. Carl sat near the open rear door where cold air drifted through the passenger car, carrying the scent of dry grass and coal smoke. Across from him, Otto carefully unfolded an American newspaper someone had left behind during the previous station stop. The paper was several days old, but the headlines still caught Carl's attention immediately. New shipyard output breaks record. Auto plants converted to aircraft engine production. Harvest expected to exceed last year despite war demands. Carl read the words twice, then a third time. They print production numbers like sports scores, Otto muttered quietly. Captain Thomas Reed overheard him while passing through the aisle carrying a clipboard and coffee cup. People follow it closely, Reed replied. Factory output, crop yields, steel quotas, keeps morale up. Carl looked out the window again toward another small farming town connected to the tracks by gravel roads and power lines. In Germany, we had shortages, he said quietly. Reed nodded once. Here we celebrate supply. The answer lingered in Carl's mind long after Reed moved away. Celebrate supply. It sounded almost absurd. Yet the more America revealed itself outside the train windows, the more the phrase began making sense. Near sunset, the train slowed beside a massive freight junction outside Omaha, where 6 separate rail lines crossed beneath towering electrical structures and switching cranes. Carl stepped outside briefly with the other prisoners while railroad crews inspected the wheels beneath the locomotives. Warm orange lights spread across the plains while freight trains moved continuously through the junction from every direction. Oil tankers, refrigerated food cars, coal shipments, flat cars, carrying bulldozers and tractors wrapped beneath heavy canvas. One train carried nothing but lumber stacked so high it resembled a moving forest. Another carried hundreds of military jeeps lined wheel to wheel beneath the fading sunlight. Carl stood motionless beside the tracks watching the machinery move around him with perfect routine. Whistles blew. Conductors checked schedules. Crane operators guided steel containers onto waiting rail cars. Nobody shouted. Nobody panicked. The entire junction operated with calm precision despite the endless activity. Nearby, a railroad worker wiped grease from his hands while speaking with another man beside a cargo manifest board. California shipment arrives tomorrow morning, one of them said casually. Then grain from Kansas after midnight. They spoke about thousands of tons of cargo the way fishermen discuss tides. Ordinary. Expected. Routine. Carl suddenly remembered standing beside bombed rail lines in Europe months earlier waiting for replacement parts that never arrived. Delays measured in weeks. Fuel shortages. Broken schedules. Here, trains cross the continent every hour carrying enough material to rebuild entire cities. Otto stared toward the freight yard and shook his head slowly. How do you fight something this large? He asked quietly. No one answered him because the question no longer felt rhetorical. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rail junction, while another freight train thundered west carrying aircraft engines beneath canvas tarps. Captain Reed stood nearby watching the prisoners with a calm expression that revealed nothing triumphal, only understanding. He had seen this realization before. Carl looked across the endless rail lines stretching toward the horizon beneath the orange Nebraska sky, and finally understood what frightened him most about America. It was not the factories. Not the cities, not even the machinery itself. It was the feeling that every part of the country moved together toward a single purpose without appearing forced to do so. As darkness settled slowly across the plains and the signal lights blinked alive beside the tracks, Carl realized he was no longer looking at separate towns, farms, railroads, and factories. He was looking at one enormous machine spread across an entire continent. The train entered Wyoming beneath a sky filled with stars so bright they seemed almost unreal after days spent passing through smoke, factory light, and industrial haze. Carl Brenner stood alone near the rear platform wrapped in a wool blanket against the cold mountain wind pushing through the cracks around the train door. The air smelled different here. Cleaner. Dry sagebrush mixed with coal smoke from the locomotive ahead. Yet even in this empty landscape, America still carried the same feeling of movement. Freight trains continued appearing beside them in the darkness. Long chains of rail cars loaded with oil drums, machinery, lumber, military vehicles. Endless motion crossing endless land. The prisoners had stopped discussing escape days ago. The country itself felt too large now, too connected, too organized. Even the silence between towns carried the distant hum of infrastructure stretching across mountains, plains, and rivers. Carl watched signal lights blink red and green beside the tracks while telephone poles raced past beneath the moonlight. Somewhere far ahead, another locomotive whistle echoed through the mountains like a sound traveling across an entire continent. Otto joined him quietly, holding a cigarette one of the American guards had traded earlier for a German lighter. Neither man spoke at first. The train climbed steadily through dark valleys where isolated factories still glowed beside rivers hidden beneath the night. Even here, even in the mountains, Carl finally broke the silence. "Do you remember what they told us in training?" Otto nodded slowly. That America was weak, corrupt, controlled by money. Carl stared out into the darkness beyond the rails. "Maybe money builds railroads." Otto gave a quiet laugh beneath his breath before the sound faded quickly into silence again. Captain Thomas Reed stepped onto the rear platform moments later, carrying his coat collar high against the freezing air. He stood beside the prisoners without tension or suspicion, simply another tired man traveling west through the night. Below them, the tracks curved along the side of a canyon where freight trains moved far beneath, like glowing insects threading through darkness. Reed followed Carl's gaze toward the endless lines of cargo moving below. "Hard to imagine, isn't it?" he said quietly. Carl looked at him for several seconds before answering. "In Germany, we believed war was won by courage." Reed nodded once. "Courage matters." He paused briefly while another freight train thundered past beneath them, carrying oil tankers westward through the canyon. "But eventually somebody has to build everything." The sentence settled heavily between them while the mountains rolled silently around the train beneath the stars. Carl thought about the factories in Pittsburgh, the aircraft plants in Ohio, the freight terminals in Chicago, the endless farms connected by railroads and power lines across the plains. For years he had imagined industrial strength as something abstract, statistics printed in newspapers, numbers discussed by generals far from ordinary life. But America had made those numbers visible, tangible. The country itself felt engineered for production. Every river carried cargo. Every railroad fed another system. Every factory connected to another by schedules, fuel, electricity, steel. Nothing appeared isolated. Nothing appeared accidental. The realization exhausted him in a way he could not fully explain. Somewhere behind them lay Europe with its ruined rail lines, shortages, and darkened cities. Ahead stretched thousands more miles of American infrastructure still operating at full capacity beneath the stars. Otto flicked ash into the freezing wind. "So this is why they are not afraid," he murmured quietly. Carl looked down into the canyon, where another freight train curved through the darkness far below, carrying endless lines of illuminated tank cars westward. "No," he answered slowly. "This is why they can afford not to be." Captain Reed said nothing after that. He simply stood beside them while cold mountain air rushed across the rear platform, and the train climbed steadily through the Rockies beneath a sky untouched by blackout curtains or distant fires. For the first time since arriving in America, Carl no longer felt anger toward the country surrounding him. Only a strange, quiet clarity. The war had never truly been between armies alone. It had been between systems, between ways of organizing an entire civilization. And somewhere during the long journey west through factories, railroads, farms, shipyards, and cities glowing through the night, Carl realized America had not simply built weapons for the war. It had built momentum itself. 3 days after arriving in America, the train finally descended from the mountains into the wide desert valleys of the Southwest beneath a pale gold sunrise. Carl Brenner stood beside the window long before dawn, watching the darkness slowly retreat from the landscape outside. The sky brightened inch by inch above distant mesas while cold morning light spilled across endless stretches of dry earth and railroad tracks that seemed to run forever toward the horizon. Even here, in a place that looked almost empty compared to the factory cities back east, the signs of movement remained constant. Freight trains still crossed the desert carrying fuel, machinery, lumber, military vehicles. Telephone lines still followed the tracks mile after mile. Small industrial depots appeared beside isolated towns where water towers rose above repair garages, warehouses, and fueling stations connected to the larger machines spread across the continent. Carl no longer reacted with visible surprise when another freight convoy thundered past the windows. The disbelief had slowly transformed into something quieter during the journey west. Acceptance. Understanding. Around mid-morning, the transport train slowed outside a military processing camp built beside a dry riverbed several miles from a small desert town. Watchtowers rose above long rows of barracks painted in faded brown. Beyond the fences sat maintenance depots, truck garages, fuel tanks, storage warehouses, and rail sidings crowded with supplies arriving from every direction. Even the prisoner camp appeared organized with the same efficient rhythm Carl had seen across the entire country. Trucks moved through the compound carrying lumber and food crates, while civilian workers repaired fencing beneath the bright desert sun. Nothing looked temporary. Nothing looked strained. Otto stood beside Carl as the train finally rolled toward the unloading platform. After everything we saw, Otto murmured quietly, "This camp almost feels small." Carl looked out across the sprawling compound and realized Otto was right. Days earlier the camp would have seemed enormous. Now it looked like only one small gear inside something vastly larger. Captain Thomas Reed gathered paperwork near the door while military police officers prepared the prisoners for transfer. Yet even now Reed showed no triumph in his expression, only fatigue, professionalism, the calm confidence Carl had seen in railroad workers, factory crews, and farmers all across the country. Before the prisoners stepped off the train, Reed paused beside Carl one final time. "You will be assigned work details after processing," he said. "Mostly agricultural support and maintenance." Carl nodded silently. Then, after several seconds, he asked the question that had remained in his mind since crossing the Atlantic. Did Americans always know they could outproduce everyone else? Reed looked toward the endless rail lines stretching behind the camp, where another freight train moved slowly through the desert, carrying rows of military trucks beneath canvas covers. "Probably not," he answered quietly. But once the factories started moving, people figured it out pretty fast. The answer carried no arrogance, only simple certainty. Carl stepped down onto the platform beneath the dry desert wind, while locomotives hissed behind him in the sunlight. Nearby, workers unloaded crates of machine parts beside stacks of fresh lumber, waiting for new construction projects inside the camp. Somewhere beyond the barracks, engines rumbled continuously from a maintenance yard repairing trucks destined for another shipment west. The sound never fully stopped. Carl looked back toward the train one final time. For 3 days it had carried him across a nation connected by steel rails, electrical lines, factories, farms, rivers, highways, warehouses, shipyards, and endless freight moving in every direction. He remembered the glowing factory valleys in Pennsylvania, the aircraft plants in Ohio, Chicago burning with electric light after midnight, grain trains crossing Nebraska beneath orange sunsets, freight lines threading silently through the Rocky Mountains under the stars. Piece by piece, the journey had dismantled the image of America he carried in his head before capture. Not through speeches, not through propaganda, through observation, through scale, through ordinary people working ordinary jobs with extraordinary momentum behind them. A hot desert wind rolled across the platform carrying dust and the distant smell of diesel fuel, while another freight whistle echoed somewhere beyond the horizon. Carl watched the endless rail lines disappear westward beneath the bright American sky, and finally understood the truth no battlefield alone could reveal. Empires marched with flags and speeches, but this country moved with electricity, steel, schedules, engines, factories, harvests, and people who believed tomorrow could always be built larger than today.